I don't know how to explain my views about the troubles of the world. I believe, as Pope Carl does, that there is an absolute truth, that our responsibility as armies are to protect children. I don't know whether it extends to the womb because I think that there are developmental and gestational phases that people have discussed. I think if slander and secrecy and shame were not a problem, you could reduce the time that was available and to something of a consensus. But aside from that, I don't think the issues should be stirred up together in a witch's plot, the way Michael Johnson appears to think they should be. We have an absolute responsibility to protect the children of Gaza. That is absolute. We have no responsibility whatsoever to um, cater to the moronic intellectual battering rams of UW dialectical and their claims about imperialism around the world. They were the ones who murdered the liberal leaders who said that we care. They were the ones who hot-wired around ending hunger with the Hunger Project, the suggestion for worldwide clean water in favor of Two Virgins Pussy Ball. Yes, they were. The yes we can people, yes, they were the ones who did that. I don't really think that Barack Obama really won an election so much as he was a corporate idea from the Jeffens, and they uploaded him as what is known as a corporate installation. He did not represent, in my view, black culture as I have learned it in America, which has been one of people pulling together to raise each other up. I didn't like the slimy idea of Cornel West's insistence on mingling as a form of disease acceptance during the AIDS attack. I think that mandatory contagion being a moral absolute was an absurd contribution to genocide. They spooked the horses at the burning barn and turned it into spinner beanie philosophy. Much as the people who invaded Israel fully knew that they were going to trigger a backlash against the helpless and the innocent, who are and remain very confused about what is going on. Our responsibility is to protect the children, not to contaminate one another. When they came supposedly riding on their white horses, the Zappas, who wrote One Size Fits All, said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That is not a responsible thing to do in the circumstances of public contagion. It is not a responsible thing to do when you're trying to save the at risk. It's not a responsible thing to do when you're trying to cope with the mortified and the afflicted. What it is instead is a bizarre idea that came from Paul McCartney to initial plague mass for his holy enigma. Sean Strupp went to the Dakota for John Lennon with Mark David Chapman, joined the Green Party as a Holocaust ancestor, and as progeny with the Holocaust ancestors, and then took a messianic blood oath like Aaron Bushnell and killed himself. I don't know if Hamas would make a street called Sean Strupp Boulevard, full knowing that he did that in that way, in that spirit, for that ends. I believe that Nosferatu would. I believe that what we are dealing with are crooked contenders. When you look at the situation in Gaza, like a UFO, the Mick Jagger band beamed down from Star Trek and did a war dance while Brian Eno released Brains in Our Hands rap songs to make a production studio, Music for Genocide from Eno, of The Ordeal. And the Three Faces of Eve's Kid, Roger Waters, saying, don't ask, it's none of your business how many hundreds of millions of dollars I have, as a metaphor for medical records. And in his spine-tingling neon prophecy mind, he said that he represented the people who want to rescue Palestine and establish a state. And he was offering $25,000 to the flag. The portion of my budget that goes to helping Palestine, while insignificant compared to $25,000, is certainly larger of my overall budget than his contribution. Certainly, I would never have pushed this theater of criminality for self-promotion. But the point is, who can miss the partnership between Mick Jagger and Roger Waters? Who would deny it? It's perfectly clear. Anybody who thinks about it for 5 minutes would realize they are acting in concert. And you have Yanis working with Eno. He's from the left in Greece, in Europe. So the left axis, the Lebanese sisters of Yoko Ono, working with Foucault, who met with the Ayatollah, have it all figured out. The only thing that they did wrong was to believe that everybody, every single person, with no exceptions, would look at the cinema evidence that this was an insider guild in the counterfeiting system of Hollywood taking over our information processes to control what people believe. They believe that no matter how many times Yoko Ono murdered the Kennedys, that her gang went after the leaders who care, that she contradicted and poisoned the people who believed that John Lennon was telling the truth and was sane, and his conduct was intended to comfort the community. No matter how many times she attacks the people who loved Lennon, no matter how many times she betrays what he claimed to stand for, that nobody ever would see through it to Lennon's lemmings Houdini, that Lennon was a tyrannical fascist, should have been obvious to everyone. That he pulled a Houdini as a statement should be by now obvious to everyone. It should have been obvious that something was wrong with them. And yet, nobody ever said a word. They seemed to have the blessing of the police department in their collar of their own following. They collared their own following. It's the weirdest story ever told, but it has a certain malicious logic. He represented the satanic verses, and he drove the doomed to their fate. In the eyes of Chapman, he was a saint. In the eyes of Sean Straub, he was a leader. In the eyes of Seattle Q, he was a mocker, a laugher, someone who pulled a ferocious, malicious joke against the 60s world and resistance to Adolf Hitler. They called him Casper. They called him Lazarus. They called him the Walrus. They called him Blythe Sanders. They called him the Phoenix Program. It was all thought out. What is this story coming from the maniacal mind of Peter Gabriel? Does he really think that we're in an electromagnetic hallucination put on by extraterrestrials? Is that what we want as our leader? Do the women actually want to be bullied into marrying people before they can have freedom of love and romance? Well, the idea that we have overpopulation is something that is charged with accepting the rationalizations of the oil industry, the fossil fuel, the failure to distribute income through governmental processes by building sustainable development that meets our sustainable development goals. We've given in to bullying and ecocide. If there is so-called overpopulation, it's not being addressed by the terrifying expenditures on the stupidity of global misconduct and warfare. It's not looking after the children to slaughter them. I repeat, it is not looking after the children to slaughter them. And what we get are beer-bellied drunkards in places like the city of Pittsburgh who said, I have a homeless man sleeping on my couch. Therefore, you need to think of me as a pope when I go about terrorizing, torturing, abusing, slandering, and battering, and threatening to kill and making snuff movies of victims of my organized pedophilia. You don't like organized pedophilia. Is that what you're saying? Well, here, I got a homeless guy sleeping on my couch. See, that out-harnesses your dislike of my brutal slavery of children. That's the city of Pittsburgh. When we look at Nosferatu, they have people who are raping prisoners and shooting residential areas, just strafing them because they say they were bored. And the United States of America is loading them up with bombs. We have a druggie claiming that a worm ate his brain, but he's still rational, cheering that activity. It's not to be cheered. It's to be condemned. It needs to be stopped. Our responsibility is to the children. You should ask Pope Carl his views about abortion, not me. I'm not the one who's responsible for burying children alive and saying, no, that's like abortion. I'm not the one doing it. It shouldn't be being done. I'm not Mike Johnson. I left it up to the women and the people paying the women as attack prostitutes like Pope Carl, because the abortions that are attributed to me were paid for and sponsored by organized Pope Carls from Operation Rescue. That's right. They did it to tar and feather their object lesson. And they were calling for forgiveness in return for forgiveness. They were saying was Casper, the friendly ghost, the friendly fascist. Casper, back from the dead. Lazarus, who they sometimes called Hitler, back from the dead, as chaplains in Franklin Graham's Contra Army. They called them the Walrus, and it was all planned out by Michael Reagan and John Lennon with the help of Yoko Ono as an Axis fairy tale about what they pulled in the AIDS attack. That's the bottom line. It can't be unwritten from history. It's a fact. What we need to do is worry about our public schools, worry about our condition as honorable people trying to provide for the less fortunate. We need to come to terms with the water crisis, the ecology crisis, the food crisis. We need to end hunger. We don't need to be bullied. We need to question. We don't need to be repossessed by people who are ripper hatters from the margins of the ultra class, like Michael Foucault. What we need to do is our own research in schools that encourage humanitarian efforts. We don't need to lecture each other about sex out of wedlock. We don't need to scold each other about differences of opinion concerning religion. We don't need to target minorities. What we need to do is open our hearts to the obvious institutions that exist to help the human race, like Doctors Without Borders. Preserve the human race, like Smithsonian Institute. We shouldn't be bombing the archives that show the legacy of Palestine. We need to preserve Palestine. We need to be affirmative about the preservation of Palestine because of how much carnage and destruction there has been. I'm not telling you to forget the Congo. I'm not telling you to forget Sudan. I'm telling you to harden your hearts and close your mind to Seattle Green Party. They are criminally insane. They are the ones who have done this purposefully. They pulled the plug on dignity back in the 80s, claiming Reagan didn't know about the deranged plan that they followed to the letter in the name of Yoko Ono and John Lennon. The inconsistencies add up. They add up one after another. And the whole edifice and claim and hypnotic projection that Arnold Schwarzenegger put together with his cronies in Access Hollywood falls down in a shambles. The evidence is clear. Reagan participated in the murder of JFK. Reagan wrote the Burston script along with his company. He staged his assassination attempt as a fake. Donald Toone reconstructed it because he believes it is a power that is justified in government. He did it as a demonstration project. Here, take a look. This is what things like that look like. They're called for sometimes. It's a non-conventional weapon and it's not nuclear. It's a way of brainwashing people into believing and accepting totalitarianism. It's a figment of your imagination anyway, right? Life is just a dream. It's strawberry fields or strawberry fields forever. Put a stop to it. Open your minds. Stand for what you do stand for. Save the children. Work with UNICEF and protect the elderly and infirm too. Get a job and think. Go to schools where they have meaningful educations. The answer to this mischief is to stop it. Now, I'm willing to debate Norman Finkelstein on the issue of whether pornography is part of a Holocaust in the womb. But we're not going to get anywhere, literally nowhere, denying that that was the subconscious foundation of how they have gotten away with so much crime. They refuse to allow framed the essential question: does pornography contribute to a Holocaust in the womb? That's what all of the Bush mania was about. That's what all of the Reagan mania was about. That's what all the Red Scare sci-fi was about. That's what Roe versus Wade was about. Monroe versus Henry Wade, the sheriff who framed Oswald. That's what the murder of the Kennedys and King was about. King was murdered among sanitation workers in a script that correlated it to the loss of virginity of Manson cinema starlet Dee Dee Mancini, whose sister Neva is the name of a gigantic pornography corporation. Is pornography contributing to a Holocaust in the womb? Nancy Pelosi needs to be asked that question. Kamala, God's gift, Harris, needs to be asked that question. Your girlfriend, your mother, and your grandmother, your daughter need to be asked that question. Pierce County Council needs to be asked that question. The boogeymen of Seattle Hijinks Authority need to be asked that question. Rosa Clemente of the Green Party and Angela Davis need to be asked that question. Joe Biden and Jill Biden and their children need to be asked the question. Norman Finkelstein needs to be asked, did you do this? Did you go along with Gail Burstyn because you believe that pornography contributes to a Holocaust in the womb? Sean Brooks needs to be asked that question. Pitt, NAACP needs to be asked that question. Vladimir Putin needs to be asked that question. The Ayatollahs of Iran need to be asked that question. Leader Kim of North Korea needs to be asked that question. Macron needs to be asked that question. Because this is the tune that they're all dancing to. This is the fire under their naked feet. This is what they pulled in Gaza. This is the mindset at work in Hitler-Reagan semiotics. This is the idea that has Mick Jagger and Roger Waters laughing their asses off in the room behind the revolving bookshelf in Access Hollywood. This is what Clint Eastwood is pulling the trigger about. This is what is real and dangerous to leave unquestioned, unanswered, and unaddressed. It's the ghost in the machine, as Arthur Koestler would call it. It's the eye paint on Bob Dylan. It's the lipstick